I want to talk to you a few minutes about the word criticism as it is used in literary contexts. This is a word I had a bad experience with as an undergraduate in college. No one bothered to explain it to me. Thus, I just thought that it meant to find fault with, like when we criticize someone's hairstyle or behavior. So when my professor said, I want you to write a 3-page critical paper on this poem or that story, I thought, but I don't want to. I like that poem or I like that story. Somewhere along the line, I figured out that criticism in a literary context means something different. Criticism refers to a careful analysis of a literary work. It often has nothing to do with finding fault with. It always has to do with explaining how and why the piece of literature works, what it means, and how we come to understand its meaning. Now, this takes us to the question of how people go about interpreting literature. This is an introductory literature class, so we aren't going to go into this topic in much depth. But I do want you to know that there are people who spend their lives exploring the question of how best to interpret literature. Obviously, different people come up with different answers, and that has led to schools of criticism or different methods of interpreting literature. Let me mention 4: textual criticism, biographical criticism, historical criticism, and psychological criticism. Let's take them one at a time. First, one school of criticism is textual criticism. This method of analysis and interpretation says that when analyzing and explaining a piece of literature, you consider only the text and nothing else. If you're considering a poem, for example, you look at each line. You consider imagery, vocabulary, narrative voice, rhyme scheme, etc. But that's all. You don't consider anything beyond what is right in front of you. Now, another school of criticism, by contrast, is biographical criticism. This method of analysis says that in order to understand fully a work of literature, we have to know something about the person who wrote it. When and where did that person live? What kind of upbringing did that person have? What kind of religious beliefs did that person hold? Etc. The biographical critics then take all of that information and use it to find meaning in the work under construction. And sometimes this works very well. If you're reading a novel by Herman Melville, whose most famous novel is Moby Dick, it comes in handy to know that Herman Melville was a sailor for a long time, and he went on a lot of whaling expeditions. It helps explain some things. A third school of criticism is historical criticism. This method of analysis says that in order to understand fully a work of literature, we have to know when it was written. What kind of cultural and social issues were important at the time? Was there a war going on? Was there prosperity or hard times? Were people pessimistic or optimistic? The historical critics then take that information and use it to find meaning in the work they're considering. And sometimes that works really well. If you're reading any number of Charles Dickens novels, it's helpful to know that English cities, especially London, were suffering from tremendous social abuses when those books were being written. Lack of sanitation, orphans running the streets, rampant crime. If we know something about that moment in history, it explains a lot about the books. Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms was written shortly after World War I. It's about the war and its aftermath. If we know a little something about that period of history, it helps explains the book. A fourth school of criticism is psychological criticism. This method of analysis takes what we learned in the 20th century about psychology, mostly from Sigmund Freud and his psychological descendants, and applies it to literature, both ancient and modern. So we have an ancient text like Sophocles' Oedipus Rex or Oedipus the King. Some of you may have read that in high school. It was written in the 5th century BC in Greece. In the 20th century, however, it was thoroughly reinterpreted by the psychological critics as an expression of Freud's famous Oedipal complex, which you've probably studied in psychology classes. Shakespeare's Hamlet and lots of other classic literary works have been similarly reinterpreted. There are lots of other schools of criticism, but these are enough for you to see what I'm talking about. So what's the point, you may ask? I want you to be aware that literature can be interpreted in different ways, but that there is a logic behind each of these different approaches. So students sometimes ask, which one is best? And my answer to that is, it depends. It depends on what piece of literature you're considering. I see all of these various schools of criticism taken together as a toolbox. When a carpenter goes out on a job, he doesn't just take a hammer. He doesn't just take a saw. He takes a whole toolbox full of tools because every job is different and requires different tools. Sometimes knowing something about the life of a writer is important to understanding the literature, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes understanding the historical context of when it was written is important, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes we can pretty much just stick with the text, and sometimes we can't. So all schools of criticism have value. The key is learning how to use them.